How does a tree grow? Why does the wind blow? When does a flower bloom? How can a rocket shoot to the stars or land up on the moon? It's science and technology, engineering, mathematics. Get smart, keep it simple. Let's learn about STEM.
Hey guys, today we're going to talk about rockets. Rockets can be extremely complicated or very simple pieces of machinery. And rockets come in all different shapes and sizes. You have the Saturn V, a Falcon Heavy, a Delta IV, a Rocket Lab Electron, the Space Shuttle, or the Aerobee, just to name a few. There are really three main things that you need to know about rockets. The first is what type of class the rocket is. Is it a suborbital rocket or an orbital rocket? The second thing is, what type of fuel does the rocket use? Is it a solid-fueled rocket, a liquid-fueled rocket, or a combination of both? And finally, what kind of staging does the rocket have? Is it parallel staging or serial staging? Now, the first thing that we need to look at is what type of class the rocket is. Is it a suborbital rocket or an orbital rocket? The definition of an orbit is the curved path that an object follows around a body. So think about how the moon orbits the Earth, or how the Earth and all of the other planets in our solar system orbit the sun. So whatever payload the rocket puts up into space orbits the Earth, or it could orbit the moon or even orbit Mars, and then we can send people up to the International Space Station, which also orbits the Earth. So that's what an orbital class rocket is. It is a rocket that is large enough to send an object into orbit. Now, what is a suborbital rocket? Well, a suborbital rocket is a rocket that goes really high, right up to the edge of the atmosphere, and either the payload or the people inside can experience weightlessness right at the top of the apogee, which is the top portion of the path of the flight. But it eventually comes back down to Earth in a controlled manner. It never goes fast enough to truly get in an orbit around the Earth. Suborbital launches help us gain data of microgravity or weightlessness. They help us gain information about the upper portions of the atmosphere, or most recently, it could be for tourism and people just want to see what it's like to be in space for a brief moment of time. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are different ways that you can fuel a rocket. You have solid-fueled rockets, liquid-fueled rockets, or a combination of both. Well, for liquid-fueled rockets, you have the fuel and the oxygen in liquid form. The fuel can be several different types. The most common types are hydrogen, methane, or RP1, which is short for rocket propellant 1. They also carry around the oxygen. In order to have combustion at the engine, you have to have oxygen. Just the way we can light a campfire here on Earth, the fire is burning the oxygen in our air. As a rocket goes up into space, there's no oxygen in the vacuum of space, so it has to take the oxygen with it. And with liquid-fueled rockets, in order to get that oxygen and that fuel down to the engine in the appropriate mixture ratio and have it combust efficiently, you have turbo pumps and plumbing, and it can get very complicated. But you may think, well, why don't they carry it in gaseous form instead of liquid form? Well, it all goes back to density. You are able to fit more rocket fuel or more oxygen in the same amount of volume because the liquid form is more dense than the gaseous form. We have rockets that are also powered by solid rocket fuel. Just like liquid-fueled rockets have an advantage over gaseous rockets, solid-fueled rockets have an advantage over liquid-fueled rockets. Because solid is more dense than liquid, you are able to pack more material, more energy in the same volume, the same amount of space. So solid rockets give the rocket that extra kick. Probably the most famous rocket that has a combination of those two fuels is the Space Shuttle. The Space Shuttle has the two large white solid rocket boosters on the side. The orbiter in the middle, which is the plane-like structure that carries the payload and the people into orbit. I wonder how they came up with the name. And then the orbiter, after it's completed its mission, glides back down to Earth, just like an airplane, and lands on a runway. And then on the back of the orbiter, on the belly of it, you have the orange tank, which is called the external tank. That tank has the liquid fuel, hydrogen and oxygen, which power the engines that are located on the bottom of the orbiter. So you have the solid white rocket boosters and the liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen in the external tank. So the space shuttle is an example of solid fuel and liquid fuel. Finally, the last element that you need to know about rockets is the type of staging. I mentioned earlier that there are parallel staged rockets and serial staged rockets. Now, what is the difference between parallel and serial staged rockets? Parallel staged rockets, a great example is the space shuttle. You have those solid rocket boosters that fall off to the side. When you have a serial staged rocket, it refers to a rocket that's basically a cylinder and everything is vertically integrated. Now, behind me on the Smart Simple STEM desk, I have an example of a United Launch Alliance Delta IV 4-2 rocket. It has a 4-meter fairing, and a fairing is the part of the rocket that encapsulates the payload and keeps it safe as the rocket launches and travels through the atmosphere. And then the 2 is the 2 solid rocket boosters. We have the solid rocket boosters on the side, which experience parallel staging because they fall off to the side. And in the vertical integration of the Delta IV, we have a core stage, which is also called the first stage, and then we have a second stage up here. And then up in the fairings, as I mentioned earlier, is the payload, which is ultimately the object you want to get into orbit. So when you have the first stage and the second stage vertically stacked up this way, it's called serial staging. Now, why do you need to have staging? What's the point of filling something up with fuel and then throwing it away halfway through your launch? Well, in order to go into space, you have to go very, very fast. And so you need a lot of fuel to get out of Earth's gravity. Once you have expended or used all of the fuel within your solid rocket boosters or within your liquid fueled tank, you need to get rid of it because at that point, that portion of the rocket is serving no purpose. So once you have, say, burned all of the fuel within the core stage, you drop the core stage, and with most rockets, it burns up in the atmosphere, but with the exception of the SpaceX rockets, the Falcon 9 or the Falcon Heavy, the core stages come back and land on Earth. Then the second stage is much smaller and it goes much faster, and it's ultimately what puts the payload into its desired orbit. There are several different types of orbit: low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, or geostationary orbit. Respectively, each of those orbits get farther and farther away from the Earth. Once the second stage has gone fast enough to put the payload into orbit, the second stage releases the payload into its desired orbit. Now, if this is an orbit closer to the Earth, like a low Earth orbit, the second stage will just fall back down to Earth and burn up in the atmosphere. But if the second stage has put the payload in a higher orbit, like a geostationary orbit, the second stage will go into something that's known as a parking orbit, which means that the second stage goes very far away from Earth and it's placed in an orbit where it will not fall back to Earth and burn up in the atmosphere, and it will ideally not interfere with any other objects, payloads that are orbiting the Earth. Now, to recap on what we've learned, with our Delta IV rocket, you have two classes of rockets, suborbital and orbital. The Delta IV is an orbital class rocket because it has the capability to put payloads into space. Then we talked about what type of fuel a rocket uses: solid fueled, liquid fueled, or a combination of both. Again, the Delta IV has solid rocket boosters on the sides, and the main vertical stack of the rocket is liquid fueled. Finally, we talked about the different types of staging that rockets have. Parallel staging, or serial staging. One of the most famous examples of parallel staging is the Space Shuttle, but most rockets use parallel staging as well with small solid rocket boosters, as seen here on the Delta IV. And then for the serial staging, you have the core stage and the second stage, and then ultimately the payload. The core stage, once it's expended all of its fuel, will also fall off and burn up in the atmosphere, and then you have the second stage, which ultimately places the payload into orbit. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something. Here are some other videos that you may like, and be sure to subscribe.